kind of go through a little bit of the basics about what a compliance management system is. I'll often get questions from clients on what is a CMS, is it electronic, is it a database? And so I'm hoping to kind of dispel what it is and what it isn't. If you read the material from the CFPB and others, a CMS is how a supervised or an entity that is enforced against, and I'll get into what that means in a little bit. It's how that entity, one, establishes your compliance responsibilities, which you are supposed to do as required by federal law. This CMS would help you ensure that those responsibilities for meeting those requirements and policies are incorporated and really kind of meshed into your daily business practices, your operations, your business itself. That CMS is also a requirement to have you review your operations to ensure that you're meeting those responsibilities and that you're meeting those legal requirements. And if you find out there's a gap in your CMS or a weakness in your business, then it should talk about how you are taking these corrective actions or what steps you are taking to either update the tools that you may have in place or systems that you have in place. And then also modifying any materials like training materials, other materials that you may have in place to help correct some of those deficiencies, some of those weaknesses. And then finally, it's how you communicate those responsibilities, those requirements to all of your employees in the organization. And we'll talk about how that starts really at the top. So again, when you read the material, and by material I'm referring typically to the CFPB's Supervision and Examination Manual. And if you haven't been on the CFPB's website, you really should take a look at the exam manual. It's I don't know what last count, it's like 1,000 pages long or something. They have these different components of it. But you can get on the website and download the exam manual. And when you read through the exam manual, you'll see that the purpose of the CMS, as they indicated, is obviously first step to ensure that you are compliant with these federal consumer laws and regs, and there are quite a few of them, and to address and prevent associated risks of harm to consumers. And when you hear about the CFPB talk, even now under the new director, that is their focal goal is to prevent risk of harm to consumers. That's the whole purpose, making sure you're compliant with the law and preventing consumers from being harmed. And then I've quoted here, to maintain legal compliance, you've got to develop and maintain a sound compliance management system. Again, that's where we get this integrated into the overall framework of not only a product design, but how you deliver that product, how you administer that product, and across the entire life cycle. And which is interesting about buy here, pay here dealers, obviously, is not only do you have an origination component, right, where you're originating the contract, getting the consumer to sign and finance the purchase of the car, but you've got the servicing and collection component. And that's where it gets really tricky, but you have to look at it from the whole life cycle. I mean, we're talking even at the marketing stage, how you might market and advertise the products and services that you're going to provide. So that's spelled out in the exam manual. Question is it really required? I mean, is this just a guideline, or is it really required? And they will tell you, and they being the CFPB, they will tell you that they expect every regulated entity under their supervisory authority and their enforcement authority to have an effective CMS that has been adapted to your operations. So a couple points there. If you're a buy here, pay here dealer, you're technically not subject to their supervision. And by supervision, I mean that they can't really just show up one day at your dealership and start examining you like a state regulator could. But you are subject to enforcement authority. The Bureau can enforce all of these federal consumer laws and regulations against your dealership. And that's where a little bit of the confusion arises, because people don't understand that, well, I'm not subject to supervision, so I'm good, right? No, it's enforcement authority as well. And the way that the Bureau enforces that authority is they can issue what they call a CID, or civil investigative demand. Basically, it's like a subpoena on steroids, where they could allege that you violated federal law, and they're supposed to tell you what that alleged violation is. And many times they will ask you to provide certain documents or answer interrogatories. I mean, it's just like a subpoena. It's just like a lawsuit. And one of the first questions that they ask is, do you have a CMS, and provide us with a copy of your CMS? And I've seen these CIDs, I've read them, and they ask these, I mean, just a ton of questions. But of course, they are looking for you to provide a copy of your CMS. Now, you may never see the CFPB come your way, but, you know, I know there have been cases like Herbie's Auto, buy here, pay here dealer, happened to say something in the marketplace, and then they received a CID, and, you know, the CFPB hit them with a nice little fine. So it can and it does happen, and state regulators are also catching on. State regulators are asking the question, do you have a CMS? As our plaintiffs' attorneys are using the fact that you may or may not have a CMS against you, because if you don't, then, well, guess what? You're not ensuring compliance. You're not preventing risks of consumer harm, as you should as an entity that's subject to enforcement authority by the CFPB. Unless you need any more motivation, I'm glad we've got a really good group, looks like, a large group, so I'm hoping everyone here is pretty motivated. But if you need motivation to provide back home, the examination manual does say that an exam will include an initial review to help determine the scope and intensity of the exam. They will be looking at components of your CMS. Again, that's in the examination stage. You can sure trot out the Herbie's Auto case, the other CIDs that have been issued, as some motivation to get the management or the owners of the business to invest in a robust CMS. They will also, the Bureau has also said that the Bureau will have their examiners consider their institution's compliance management system and efforts to come into compliance. And in fact, kind of going to what a CMS actually looks like, if you download and take a look at that supervision and examination manual, they have a little component that describes what the examiner is looking for in a compliance management system. So it's really, really helpful guide that you can use to say, all right, here is the CMS that we have. Here's what the examination manual requires, what the examiners are going to be looking for, or what their enforcement attorneys are going to be looking for, or heck, even a plaintiff's attorney or AG may be looking for. You could use that as a really good guide to figure out, where does mine stack up? Where does our CMS fall into line? Or are we missing some things? That exam manual's got a really good summary of what should be in a CMS. But just to quickly summarize it for you, it used to be 4 interdependent control components, and they've kind of shortened it into 2. First is a board and senior management oversight component, and the next is a compliance program. And they've kind of lumped all this into the compliance program, which includes your policies, your procedures. It has a training component, because obviously we talked about, communicating that CMS out to your employees. There's a training component of that. There's a monitoring and auditing component, and I'll talk about how those are different, and they certainly are different. And then a complaint management program. A lot of you probably deal with complaints, but this is a more formalized complaint management type of program. So again, it's got to be formal, it's got to be written. Can't just be, word of mouth. This is how we've always done it. It's kind of like, I would equate it going back to grade school, where you could come up with the right answer in math class, but you have to show your work. It's almost like that. You have to show and prove up that we are compliant, and it really is showing your work to have it written down like that. It has to be risk-based, so you need to look at the areas in which you operate, and those that have maybe a high risk, maybe sending out a repossession agent to repo a vehicle, that's high risk. That is consumer facing, could get the consumer at not a good time. That's a risk-based type of approach, looking at those areas of high risk and trying to manage that the best you can from a risk-based perspective. We talked about it being comprehensive, cradle to grave, from even marketing to delivery of the product and the execution of the contract, servicing and collecting component. And it's got to be integrated into the framework of your operations. By that I mean, it's not just a form that you can take off the shelf and go put your name on it and say, this is our CMS. You really need to take the components of it and kind of weave it into your business and operations and make sure that it conforms to what you are doing or want to be doing, hopefully in compliance with the law. And again, we talked about the entire life cycle of that credit product and service. The first component, the board and senior management oversight, again, we're talking about setting those clear expectations from the management or the board or the owner about the responsibility for compliance. It really does start at the top, and it's got to start from the top. One of the issues I'll talk about that Jessica had raised in some of her slides was, if you don't have buy-in at the top from the management, from the ownership, it's just not going to work. The employees are going to see that they can let things slide. They don't have to comply. So it's really got to have clear expectations from the very top. And it kind of goes into the next one about creating this culture of compliance. And we could probably do a whole session on what is culture of compliance. A lot of times, when you go into a business or organization, if they are willing to bend the rules or maybe break some rules versus, no, we're going to do it by the book. This is the right way to do it. We are going to stay within the lines and not operate in the gray. But it really is starting, again, at the top to try to create and encourage and promote a culture of compliance within the dealership. You've got to staff it. The board and the owners really have to staff the compliance function. We can't just give somebody a new title, all these responsibilities with no support, no resources, which, yes, there is going to be a financial commitment to have that compliance person, but you've got to staff it correctly. You've got to give them the resources, the tools that they need to make the program work and operate effectively. And then finally, meaningful reporting. And by that I mean, there's got to be a reporting function that goes back to the board for some of those high-risk areas, high-risk issues that the board or management or ownership should be made aware of. And then also what happens, how those issues are resolved. Do we have to make restitution or refunds to a consumer? How are these complaints resolved? It's got to be reported back up to the board. So again, it's getting their engagement, getting their involvement in this entire culture and as a part of our CMS. So on the compliance program side, we talked about policies and procedures, and there is a difference. A policy is kind of like, it's like a broad statement. All right, we do not discriminate against anyone. All right, that is your policy. I get it. That's fine. That's great. But the procedures it's the meat and potatoes. It's like, that is our policy, but how do we comply? What are our steps that we take to comply to show that we are not discriminating against somebody getting credit? That's really where it meets the road. So you've got to have both components. Policy is what is the law, what is the requirements. Procedure is how do we ensure that we are complying with those requirements. Again, it's putting those things in writing, showing and proving your work. So these policies and procedures, address managing compliance in those products, those services, things that you're doing. They've got to be consistent with a board-approved compliance policy, and they've got to address compliance with those federal consumer financial laws. And like I said, there's a lot of them. There should be that training component. The training should have, really it should serve as a kind of a training and reference tool for employees in doing their day-to-day activities. So that training is reinforcement of those policies and procedures. Want to make sure that they understand compliance, their resources that they have available to them, the steps that they need to take in their job to be able to comply with the law. And then finally, the last part of the compliance program is monitoring and corrective action. You're monitoring for compliance, and that is something that's really done versus audit. It's done on a more frequent basis than an audit. It's usually less formal. We're just monitoring things, watching how things operate, and that can be done by the business unit itself. Maybe they're looking at their own actions or checking their own. and if they do find something, making sure that corrective action is taken. Again, these policies and procedures, or CMS, should be administered by a compliance officer. So again, red flags and a lot of these other, like privacy rule, did require that a compliance officer be appointed. Well, you should already have one, hopefully. These policies and procedures, this CMS, should be administered by a compliance officer. And again, we talk about the full life cycle. They've got to be current and complete. Okay, I'll see a few CMSs that they are not current, they are not complete. They only cover just the policy perspective of it. They don't actually cover the procedure component of it. So it's got to be current and complete. We talked about the training. Again, not just the employees in the organization. Guess who else has to be trained? The owners, the management. I'll come in sometimes and do board of directors training on like UDAP or certain issues that they may be concerned about, but the board has to know what they don't know. I mean, they've got to be trained as well. The scariest thing is when, there are things that you should know but you don't know, and that's pretty scary. And sometimes the board or management just doesn't know what they don't know. And if you are a compliance officer, sometimes that's your job, to let them know what the law is, what cases are coming up, what the FTC is attacking. I think armed with that knowledge, then they might have a better perspective about having a compliant organization or a culture of compliance. And then finally, that monitoring and audit and corrective action. Let's see. On the compliance officer component, again, they need sufficient resources. That could include, sufficient budget, sufficient training. And there's lots of groups, like NIADA, that does a great job in training. There are others out there as well that do a fair amount of training. But they've got to get access to those resources so they can understand and know what they don't know. There's a lot out there to deal with. They need to have access to the board, to the senior management, to the owners of the organization. There needs to be a clear line between the compliance officer to report up to the ownership or the board. And then if you do have legal in-house or maybe outside counsel, that they would then work with outside counsel or in-house counsel on issues they may find. On the complaint management program, really when you think about this, it's more of like a centralized complaint tracking mechanism. And I've seen different programs like this. I've seen some that are just, Excel-based. I've seen some that are computerized-based. I don't know that I really care how you are tracking those complaints, but they really should be centralized and have somebody responsible for tracking all of those complaints. The reason being is that the Bureau looks at these complaints and they expect you to do this root cause analysis. Anybody heard that term? It's almost like a root canal, but it's a root cause analysis of looking at why did they complain, what are they complaining about, is this a symptom of a deeper issue that we need to be concerned about? Maybe somebody's calling about a late charge that was assessed. Maybe that late charge was too high. If you've got a problem with one customer, that might be systemic. You might have problems with all these other customers that you're charging late charge. So they expect you to do this root cause analysis and then categorize these different complaints and also, define what a complaint may be. But as a part of that, doing that analysis. They expect you to escalate those complaints as appropriate. So, and by escalation, I mean we're talking about issues that may be of very importance to the organization, like fair lending or discrimination type claims. Those should be escalated on up. We're talking like, sales practices. I was defrauded. Somebody lied to me in the sales practice or closing the transaction, or I didn't buy this Gap product, or I didn't buy this service contract. Things like that, there should be an escalation process as appropriate. Again, you're looking for trends because some of these issues could certainly amount to a trend. I can tell you the AGs look for trends like this. On the complaints that they get, the Attorney General or aspiring governor, they're looking for trends in these complaints to see if there's an issue there. And you should be doing the same thing on your business because you may need to make changes as necessary. Really, it's a tool to gather intelligence, and you've got to document. Documentation on these things is certainly critical. The audit component, they've got to be sufficiently independent, so we're not talking the business unit auditing itself. It could either be like a separate audit person, in your company, in your organization, or it could be like a third party. Maybe you hire a third party company that comes out and does an audit of your business, your operations, your contracts, but it's got to be independent. They will also look to make sure it's a periodic component. That report also has to go up again to the board, to the senior management, to the ownership. One of the questions they ask in a CID is, have you had any audits performed? And we want to see copies of your audit reports. They definitely look for that. And the worst thing that you can have is an audit where they found problems and you did nothing to correct it. So if you're going to do this, much like having a policy procedure, if you have a policy, you've got to follow your policy. You can't just have it out there and not follow it. Same with audits. If you get something back, you need to make sure you take steps to correct what they found. Service provider oversight. This, I think, is becoming the Bureau has certainly looked at this, and I think this is going to become an even bigger issue. But really, it's the way that the Bureau looks at it is they hold you responsible for the actions of your service providers. The repo agents that you may hire, the cleaning crew that you have come in to clean the dealership, they're looking to hold you accountable for the actions of those that you hire. May not be fair, may not be right, but that's how they look at it. And they expect you to have a service provider program, in essence, how you're overseeing those that you hire, overseeing their compliance with these federal consumer laws. We're talking data security, safeguarding issues. They've got access to information in the car about the consumer, maybe some documents, that might be laying around the dealership or that they can get access to. So there's got to be this oversight program. And again, we're looking at risk that may happen or risk of harm to consumers and making sure that they are complying with those federal consumer laws. On the implementation side, again, implementation is critical. It's got to reach every aspect of your business. The key is do what you say what you do. I hear a lot of comments about, you're talking the talk, but do you walk the walk? And it really boils down to it. So it's not an easy process. It's more of an evolutionary process. I've worked on these CMS and have developed a template CMS that we provide and have gone through this process with quite a few different types of clients, including dealerships, buy here, pay here dealerships. But it's not a quick and easy process. It does take time to do it. I think once you go through the process, you're better on the end of the process, but it is a process for sure. Some of the issues that have come up, and I'll save a few minutes for time or for questions here. Some of the issues that I think Jessica was going to talk about, difficulty getting company buy-in because the leaders of that organization didn't want certain areas to be affected, and they would not communicate the why to the departments. It wouldn't hold people accountable for the failure to comply. So again, it goes back to that issue of having the buy-in from the senior management, from the ownership, from the leadership of the organization, to getting that buy-in on having a culture of compliance. Limited resources, that kind of speaks for itself. Setting maybe a low budget where you're having some of the testing, some of the monitoring that is done, that was done just on a manual basis and not utilizing some of the tools and software that we have out there in the marketplace. And so those resources were really limited, and having to do a lot of this testing on a manual basis that really just takes up a lot of time because of the limited resources that were not available to the testing folks. Limited agents, maybe you've got a compliance person, but that person already has, 2 or 3 other hats. and you don't have a very large compliance department, or maybe their time is taken up with trainings or other responsibilities that they have. So one of the things that she had found is, having a very small department like that and not really a lot of resources, then you can't implement some of these different policies because there's a lot of work, a lot of manual work that has to be done for policies that were in place. You don't have time to implement some of these new policies. Some of these other issues that she had found, people like to, people are kind of stuck in what we do, and I'm probably guilty of it as well, but, once you have a way of doing things, well, that's the way it's always been done. That's the way we've always done it, right? So they're accustomed to their current process, and making somebody break that process or that habit takes some time, because you've got to monitor for that, you've got to audit for that to make sure that they are changing that habit, maybe a bad habit, but you've got to change that, and that takes a lot of time. Some of the employees may feel that these steps to comply, well, hey, it just adds to my workload, and it's really not benefiting me. In fact, it's taking longer for me to do my job, so I'm not going to do it. We all know employees that have a workaround. There's almost always a workaround. But again, that starts at the top, having the management, the ownership describe why we need to be compliant, what it's going to take to have that culture of compliance. And it goes back to the top, because it's got to be ingrained in the culture. And it takes some time. It's certainly a process to change that culture around. I do think that organizations, dealerships, finance companies that do change their culture more towards compliance will be around a lot longer than those that don't. We've seen, certainly, the perception is that the CFPB is down. They're not as active as they once were. Certainly, that's true under Cordray. They're not as active. They were as active under Cordray, but not now under Mulvaney and the new director, Kraniger. But guess what? The FTC has taken a big leap or two in the last 6 to 8 months. They are a lot more active than they've ever been. State attorneys general are a lot more active. I mean, look at Delaware and Massachusetts. Look at some of the East Coast states. They are extremely active. And some of the AGs are not shy about using their new enforcement authority under Dodd-Frank to enforce some of these same federal consumer financial laws against you. They have that new authority under Dodd-Frank, and they can certainly use it. And some are more apt to use it than others. So, some of the recommendations, if you are just thinking about, look, we need to implement a CMS, but where do we get started? Again, taking a look at that supervision exam manual will certainly help. That will give you an idea of what they are expecting and kind of the framework for that. Set a realistic budget for both building the CMS, and once you've got it built, you've got to maintain it. It's one of those, it's kind of like keeping the car running. You've got to get the oil changed. You've got to get the tires rotated. You've got to maintain that CMS much like you would a vehicle. If you've got somebody in-house that is well respected, that is kind of a type A personality that likes compliance, either you hire them or you bring them up to where they can then be in charge of compliance. But you need somebody that would own the CMS. I mean, you've got to have true ownership of the CMS. You've got to use the right approach to convince the board and senior management to have this buy-in on the CMS. A key selling point would be, look, if we implement this CMS, we become a more compliant organization, then we're looking at hopefully less risk, less nights where you're awake at night counting the ceiling tiles because you're worried about some consumer that's going to sue you, or the plaintiff's attorney in town that's going to come after you. We'll have a better, more well-run organization, less risk, and less worries about plaintiff's attorneys, state attorneys general, CFPB, FTC. And if they need some motivation, go on the FTC's website. You'll see where they are actively going after dealers for alleged violations of law, both from an unfair and deceptive act or practice perspective, truth in lending, Reg Z perspective. they are extremely, extremely active. So that should be, you can send them little notes, little emails about just FYI. Here's what's going on with the FTC or a state attorney general. You'll see it all over. Google is your friend in that regard. You do need that support from the strong leaders so that other employees will follow. Again, it's got to start at the top. If the management, the ownership, doesn't provide that strong report, it won't happen. It will just fail because employees will see that they don't have to comply, they don't have to follow through, and it will just fail like a house of cards. Okay, so I left a little bit of time for questions, so I figure we might have some questions. And I think I see people taking pictures of the slides. Hopefully they'll make them available to everybody. If not, you can sure email me, and I'd be happy to send you a copy of the slide deck. So, any questions? No, it's kind of a lot of material, a lot of... For those that have started or have their CMS, anybody want to share how long a process it took them? How long it took them to develop it? I think the quickest... Yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yep. That sounds about right. I think the quickest I have ever put a CMS in place, and it was like a bare bones CMS, was I think 6 months, 4 to 6 months. It wasn't a dealership or a finance company. They were just another creditor, and we actually worked from templates. But the hard part is taking the template and then customizing it for the organization as to what they are doing, what types of credit they're offering, underwriting policies, all of that. So it definitely takes some time, but it's a good investment. Once you get it done and come out the other end, then it can really help your organization run a lot more smoothly. Any other questions? Oh yeah, sorry. So your question was, where can you find the template? Well, there's the supervision and examination manual from the CFPB. It doesn't have a template per se, but it does have a description of the CMS, and it has a description of the individual components of it. I know that NIADA has, I think on their website they were talking about they have a template for a CMS that either they or through another company provides. I know our firm, one of my partners, Nikki Monroe, and I developed a template just for buy here, pay here dealers and their related finance companies. And that took us, I think, 1.5 years, 2 years of a process to put that together. I do. We do. If you're interested, you can sure send me an email, and I'll be happy to give you more details about the template for CMS. So, and it's definitely robust. I mean, it covers cradle to grave. Like I said, you got to think about covering marketing components, origination, underwriting, servicing, collecting. All of these different components that go into a CMS. OFAC, 8300s. All of those different issues that pop up. Red flags, another example. So it is pretty robust. Wow, let an attorney go early. So, any other questions? Yeah. For a template that we charge, the average cost is $10,000, but we let folks, if they want to buy it, then we'll let them buy it out in installments, like 5 installments of $2,000 each, and then, but with the first installment payment, we go ahead and provide the templates and just assume that you'll see what you see you'll like, and you'll just pay the 4 remaining installments. So you get the template with the first installment payment. So, and I know that seems high. I think from a development cost, we probably have a lot more in it than what we will probably ever sell it for. So you have to look at it as an investment, for the organization. It certainly provides what the law is, what the requirements are. So if nothing else, it provides that. Then it talks about how you would actually try to comply with those requirements from a federal perspective. So, any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much for your time, and I'll give you about 8 minutes back to get to your next session. Thank you.